I'll now hand you over to your host for today, Chloe Forster. Chloe, go ahead.
Thank you. Hi, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. My name is Chloe Forster, and I'm a partner here at DLA Piper, based in the Technology and Sourcing Group in London, as well as being UK sector lead for consumer goods, food and retail. So today's session is of real interest to me. For our session, I'm delighted to be joined by Matthew Griffin, founder and CEO of 311 Institute, an exponential university. It's been fantastic to work with Matt in preparation for today's webinar, which I'm sure you'll all find very insightful indeed. As a futurologist, Matt will be discussing with us some of the digital trends we're seeing in the sector, covering both those that are more established and those which the most digitally evolved businesses in the sector are exploring to push the boundaries and the established norms. Some of the examples Matt will give us are designed to take us out of our comfort zone, encourage curiosity, and test our thinking. In terms of the running order, I'll be shortly handing over to Matt, who will be discussing, amongst other things, AI, the rise of NFTs, the metaverse, and how to interact with hyper-connected customers. I'll be asking a couple of short questions at the end of each section, and at the end, there'll be about 15 minutes for audience Q&As. So please pop any questions into the chat, and we'll do our best to answer them. For reference, we'll also be recording today's session, and we'll look to circulate that recording to all attendees within the next few days. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Matt.
Thank you, Chloe. So hi, everybody. I hope you're all well. That's it. And I know that we're first on in the morning. That's it. So I hope you had a good breakfast. But as you'll see, we're going to be covering the future of food among a lot of other sort of different things, basically. So I'd be very surprised if you kind of had the breakfast that the future has in store for you. So with no further ado, as Chloe said, my name is Matthew Griffin. I'm the CEO and founder of the 311 Institute. I look at two futures. So I look at the near future, which I regard as the next 20 years, because that's where the vast majority of the multinationals that I work with operate. So these are organizations like Samsung, Microsoft, Visa, Coca-Cola, PepsiCo, those kinds of organizations. But if you're a sovereign government, and I work with all G20 governments, then you typically look up to about 50 years out. Future of healthcare, future of education and wellness, basically future of tax, transportation, energy, all these kinds of different things. So while basically we're going to be having conversations about the CPG and F sector, a lot of the things that you'll actually see in this presentation will actually have far-reaching ramifications beyond the sector. For example, in things like healthcare, wellness, disease, and so on and so forth. So this is the agenda that I've put forward for you today. So I'm going to be having conversations with you about what I call legal vacuums, food and drink, retail and fashion, and then basically I'm going to be giving you a little bit of advice, maybe give myself some advice. I'm going to be giving you a little bit of advice on what you can do to prepare yourselves and your organizations for the things that are already here and the things that are already coming down the line that you're going to have to deal with and that your clients basically are going to have to deal with. Now, when we actually have a look at the future, the fact of the matter is that there are hundreds of mega trends that you and your clients basically are being subjected to, whether that's directly or indirectly. And there are hundreds of exponential technologies which we combine together to create the next generation of products or services that either transform the world, disrupt the world, or change individual sectors, businesses, lines of businesses, and so on and so forth. So if you want to understand more about these trends and technologies, then just scan this QR code and you can go and download these codexes here. And you can then read through them at your leisure. Now, I'm going to start here. When we have a look at the future, the old rules do not apply. I highly recommend, basically to yourselves, but also to the boards that I work with, that you unlearn almost everything. And the reason for that will become clear. Now, the future is also increasingly rapid. If we have a look at the changes that we've seen in the past 10 years, we all generally feel that today the world is changing faster than ever before. When we start having a look towards 2030, again, the vast majority of people feel that we will be moving faster as a society, culture, or business than we are today. Which then means that if your organization has a 10-year plan on paper, then in the real world, it's a 5 to 7 year plan. A 5-year plan is a 3-year plan. So increasingly, we have less time to see the future that is emerging, understand it, maybe predict it, and then adapt to it. But it's also more complex because a lot of the things that you've sort of thought of as science fiction are already here. And in fact, we could always argue that we're living in science fiction times now. Now, when we have a look at technologies, a lot of us typically talk in terms of, 5 to 10 powerful technologies that we really focus on. For example, we will all be talking about, say, 3D printing in the manufacturing space. We will all be talking about artificial intelligence in the intelligence space. We'll be talking about quantum computing. We will be talking about blockchain. We will be talking about augmented reality and virtual reality. And we'll be talking about technologies like 5G. This is my starburst. There are over 170 exponential technologies on it. Every single technology has an addressable market opportunity of at least $500 billion. And every single technology can either transform one industry or every industry. Now, when you start thinking about what happens when you start combining all these different technologies together, the only thing that we do is transform all of global culture, business, and society. There is not a single part of your personal lives or professional lives or your company's sort of operations or markets that is not being affected or impacted by these technologies. And you can read more about these in the codexes that I highlighted first. Now, when we start having a look at the impact that these different technologies are having, in the agricultural space, I'm going to be going through this. There's a huge amount of good disruption, ironically, in this space. When we have a look at construction over in the UAE, we are now talking about 3D printing 11-story skyscrapers. So the construction space is changing. When we have a look at the energy space, we know that we're moving from fossil fuels to renewables, but we have renewable solar panels now that are 132% energy efficient. This transition alone by 2050 is a $92 trillion shift. When we start having a look at the finance sector, we've got traditional banks being disrupted by fintechs, being disrupted by decentralized finance organizations or DeFi, where, for example, if your children are playing Roblox or Fortnite has 350 million users. It makes 95% of its money from microtransactions. And in a decentralized finance world, Roblox could be the new JP Morgan. And that's a conversation in itself. When we have a look at the future of payments, for example, we've actually got Nike that are now letting people pay for virtual merchandise using moves. So the concept of money, but also the concept of value and payments is also changing, which then leads us to the question that if I can pay Nike with my moves, or a rock, whatever it happens to be, what role does fiat currency have to play in the future? Do we really care about the US dollar or the pound or the euro in the same way that we sort of historically have thought that we should? When we have a look at healthcare, we have in vivo gene editing now that is set to cure over 6,000 inherited diseases. We have cancer vaccines for particular vaccines which are personalized to the individual's genome, but also to the genome of the cancer that we are trying to attack. That's now 100% effective. And we can 3D print human organs, including bones, cartilage, tissue, muscle, skin, as well as even hearts and brains, increasingly on demand. So by 2028, we will start living longer lives because of the sheer number of medical breakthroughs that are coming through. Now, when I talked about legal vacuums, this is very much basically what I mean. So when you think about it like this, the future is generally illegal. Because if you have a look, for example, at self-driving cars, there were no legal precedents to allow self-driving cars onto the roads, let alone the things that I'm going to be talking about. Now, this means basically that as we see the pace of change accelerate, as we see the complexity of that change increase, the regulators and the firms basically that I actually talk to are increasingly worried basically that they are out of touch basically with what's happening on the ground and with what consumers are now being given access to. So this means basically that we actually have massive legal and regulatory vacuums. For example, it's only recently that the European Union has put together guidelines for artificial intelligence. We're still trying to figure out crypto and NFTs and Web 3.0 technologies, basically from a regulatory and a legal perspective as well. So when we have a look at the economies that we're now trying to actually adapt to and understand, there are three economies, and they are distinctly different. You have the physical economy, you have the digital economy, your subscriptions and so on and so forth, but you also have the virtual economy. And the virtual economy is estimated to be worth between $8 to $13 trillion. It does include things like the metaverse and so on and so forth, but a virtual economy is different to a digital economy. A digital economy is different to a physical economy, but they do all overlap. But I think it's important that you understand the distinction between these three constructs. Now, when we have a look at the metaverse, the old rules for achieving trust in assets, data, brand experience, and transactions do not apply. We're going to be going through that. From a technology perspective, technology you can think of as this rocket ship. When we talk about things that are science fiction, I can show you basically new alien life forms that have been made from 6, 8, and 11 base paired DNA. When we talk about nanobots, I can show you nanobot swarms in the labs that are now capable of basic in vivo human surgery. So technology is this rocket ship that is already letting us do things that are way beyond anything that you've seen in the movies. And regulators and law really basically are trying to catch up with this rocket ship on a tricycle. Now, I'm not being mean here, but generally when we actually have a look at law, when we actually have a look at regulation, regulation is generally up to 10 years behind the bow wave of leading edge technologies. And I'll show you some of these. Now, the way that we actually start closing some of these gaps is we actually bring law firms, but also regulators together basically with the startups and the companies that are building these new products, these new realities, to discuss what they're doing, to look over their shoulder and to say, if you built your product like this, we would not approve it. We wouldn't know how to defend it or protect it. But if you build it like this, then we do. So regulatory and legal sandboxes are increasingly valuable as a way to bring the different communities together to understand the impact of the things that people at the leading edge are actually building today. And sort of just consider these two slides. So today we see the development of robo-lawyers, artificial intelligence lawyers, from companies like LawGeeks, Ross Intelligence, who ironically got sued and their one got shut down, but hey, that's a fun story. So consider this. At what point will your artificial intelligence lawyer put a court to an artificial intelligence judge in the UK, Estonia, or Australia, and then have its case judged by that AI judge? Bearing in mind that AI judge, as we've seen in America, could actually be biased. So your robo-lawyer could be judged by a robo-judge that is biased. How do you deal with that? And these questions are already starting to come up, and these are already starting to happen. But in addition to that, when we actually have a look at Twitter, before he left, Jack Dorsey was actually working on a project called Blue Sky. He wanted to turn Twitter into a protocol. There are about 15 companies now out there that are actually protocols. They aren't hierarchical businesses or legally enforceable business structures that you're used to. These are completely new fundamental company structures, basically, that have no head, no single point of contact. So sue my protocol. And now I think we've got time for a little bit of Q&A.
Thanks, Matt. So I just wanted to actually pick up on one of the points that you raised about the metaverse and particularly the absence of regulation in that space, which I think is a factor of a number of different issues, principally the fact that the metaverse itself is, at the moment it's still evolving in terms of what it actually is and whether there are multiple metaverse or whether there is one single interoperable metaverse. Yeah. And I think that poses a challenge to lawmakers, as well as the fact it is extraterritorial. I'm interested to get your thoughts on how you see regulators around the world coming together to face that.
Yeah, it's a good question. Thank you, Chloe. So, when we actually have a look at regulating the metaverse, so it was actually only about 6 months ago that the metaverse actually had an official dictionary definition for a start. So this is how far ahead technology is compared to even verbiage. Now, when we have a look at the metaverse basically is kind of supposed to be this overarching construct, basically, where we have individual platforms that are generally interoperable that come together, basically, to kind of create this overall world. You know, the metaverse is Earth, basically, and then each of the platforms is a country, basically, on Earth. You know, if we sort of use that kind of analogy. Now, from a regulatory perspective, you know, the vast majority of regulators basically simply don't actually have the committees or the internal structures that they need to understand the top level and low level risks basically that, you know, the metaverse actually poses. For example, you know, when we talk about things like diversity and inclusion, harassment, criminality, and so on and so forth, because, you know, with a lot of the regulators I talk to, they say, you know, no disrespect, they say, we are lawyers and policy wonks, basically we are not technologists, you know, and that's where we kind of have that gap. But, you know, organizations and countries basically that are trying to understand how they regulate the metaverse include, without really any surprise, Dubai, basically, who've launched VARA, which is their virtual assets regulatory authority, which they launched in the metaverse. But you can kind of think of the metaverse basically as this complete Wild West. Even people who are actually building the metaverse, basically like Meta, don't fully understand the risks associated with it. When we have a look at things like copyright and IP law, you know, there's all kinds of different things I could do. I could create basically a particular product basically that morphs in real time, that you can walk through, that you can buy as an NFT. So I would typically say that from a legal perspective and a regulatory perspective, we're probably only 3% done.
That's great, thanks. And I suppose just taking that upper level and thinking about just technology regulation generally, how important do you think it is for regulators to keep pace with the technology in terms of how it impacts their business and how it impacts their economy? And you mentioned Dubai there. Are there any examples where you think the regulators really are making really progressive steps?
Yeah. So it should almost be their overarching activity. Now, the reason why I say that is, if you think about all the different products and services that we're now increasingly exposed to, they are generally all combinations of technology, but those technologies are becoming increasingly sophisticated, powerful, collaborative, decentralized. You know, if we have a look at artificial intelligence, it's essentially a black box, you know, a lot of it. Now, when we have a look at the countries and the organizations that are actually doing it well, yeah, Dubai, basically, as I sort of mentioned, basically Dubai is actually doing it relatively well, but so too is the FCA in the UK. Now, this is literally basically where what we do is normally, as a startup, I would create a product, and then I would take it to the regulator and say, I have built this thing. It is a fully autonomous energy grid, for example, using artificial intelligence and blockchain and so on and so forth. At that point, the regulator will say, I have no idea what that is. I have no idea how you built it, the technologies that you used. I have no idea about the controls basically that you used to build it. And I have no idea basically how to assess the risks of this thing. The regulators in those particular cases, same with the FDA basically over in the US, basically will then take anywhere between 1 to 8 years to figure all of that out, by which point the market's moved on, that startup has now lost their market opportunity. So the way that we actually close the gap when it comes to regulation is we bring the regulators into the accelerator communities and into the multinational company R&D teams basically that are actually building these things. So the regulators, while we as a company are building this new fandangled thing, can ask questions. But it's kind of a three-way. So you've got to have the company building the new product, you've got to have the regulator, but you have to have somebody who is able to translate geek speak, you know, okay, I built my new thing using an artificial intelligence evolving neural network, into plain English, so that the regulators basically can say, well, okay, we didn't understand what he just said, but now you've put it into plain English, we kind of actually have a bit of a better feel, and these are the questions that we think that we should be asking. So you bring them together. In Dubai, basically, we call that an economic development agency. In the Middle East, generally, we're building economic development agencies. And if you download one of those codexes, the Innovation Codex, it all explains it in there.
Thank you. I've got so many more questions, but I'm conscious that you're going to talk about AI specifically in a bit more detail in the next section, as well as metaverse later on. So I'll hand back over to you for the next section.
Thank you very much. So as Chloe says, we're now going to be talking about food and drink. So hold on to your hats. Now, when we actually have a look at food and drink, the food and drink that you had basically breakfast is really unlike anything basically that we have today, let alone in the future. So for example, when we have a look at Coca-Cola, Coca-Cola released a new Coca-Cola beverage called Pixel in the metaverse. Now, this was released in Roblox, so characters could buy Pixel Coke in a Roblox game. They drank it, then they got a boost, an energy boost, and then they could actually get a QR code, and then they could go and buy the real Pixel Coke in the real world. Now, we call this a digital product, a physical and digital product, even though it's actually virtual. When we have a look at Diageo, but if you sort of step back 2 to 3 years ago, Diageo couldn't have done this, but they took a 48-year-old bottle of rare whiskey and sold it for $35,000 basically with an NFT. And that NFT, which is really just like a digital ticket, a digital token that gives you access to new things, or gives you the rights basically to a particular object or product, whether it's a physical, digital, virtual product. In this particular case, their NFT would let you go and visit the distillery, go and visit the locks up in Scotland and all that kind of stuff. But when we start talking about NFTs, this is a very, very different world again. Now, increasingly, we have organizations basically like IBM. So IBM Watson is now being, over the past couple of years, has been trying to create its own recipes. Now, that's for both food and drink. So we can already see a point in time where, for example, using a smartwatch, I can sense your cortisol levels. You might be getting slightly stressed. And an artificial intelligence in the cloud can make you the perfect drink that is then produced on demand and then flown over to you by drone. So this is increasingly where artificial intelligence basically is playing quite a large role basically in the product development cycle. Now, when we have a look at things like cattle and crops, just from a traditional cattle and crops perspective, GMOs are classified as organisms basically where we have spliced together 2 sets of DNA from different animals, species, plant varieties, and so on and so forth. So when we actually have a look at plant variety rights, GMOs are obviously front and center of that. However, today, basically using CRISPR technology, we have companies over in the US, one's called Pairwise, that is trying to develop pitless cherries, but also softer kale. We have other companies elsewhere creating super cows that are resistant to disease and to tuberculosis. But what's special about this process is they are using the CRISPR gene editing technology to knock out or silence genes that are already existing within these particular animals and crops. Now, under the US FDA rules, that means that even though you are genetically re-engineering an organism, it isn't a GMO. So that obviously has an impact on variety rights. Today we can also make meat without the animal. So we passed the 8 billion people mark last week. Now, if you want to feed 8 billion people, we can't do agriculture the way that we have always done it. So what if I could just take the cell from an animal, like a chicken, put it into an advanced manufacturing technology called a bioreactor, which replicates those cells, grows them, does what would happen naturally inside the chicken, just in a bioreactor, to create chicken nuggets. That way, we know we can make meat without the animal. But it's not fake meat, it's actually meat. So this is just a relatively straightforward extension of what we all learned in biology, cell division. But it also kind of leads to some of these new interesting questions. So my fish, and there are companies like Finless Foods, has a unique formula because I took the cell from a salmon, put it into a bioreactor, put it into a particular hormone, used a particular process to grow it and do the things that I do in order to create a salmon fillet. So this is increasingly where we are going to get embroiled basically within chemical and genetic IP rights, because I can sue you because the formula that you used to grow your fish meat in the bioreactor was actually mine. I patented it, so on and so forth. But in addition to that, when we have a look at today, a lot of people today sue food companies complaining of illness. Your food made me sick. So as we start seeing organisations like University College of London moving from using natural hormones to grow meat in this way to synthetic hormones, at what point, as lawyers, do you start seeing people coming to you saying, I ate some meat or some fish, and the synthetic hormones that they used to grow that fish made me sick. I want you to put together a class action lawsuit and go after them. Now, when we actually have a look at regulations and law, we've also seen the incumbent industries, basically in the food and drink sector, already starting to use regulation and law to try to disrupt the startups, to try to put them out of business, to slow them down and cripple them. So, for example, when we actually have a look at the creation of lab-made beef burgers in the US, we actually had the beef ranchers, and they've got consortiums and groups and everything else doing this. They went out to the markets basically and said, beef burgers grown in a lab are not approved. They're not regulated. They're not safe. You can't label it as real meat. So there was a huge amount of litigation across the whole of the US in 2019. And it led the US Senate to do this. They introduced the HR 4881 Act. It's called the Real Meat Act. And after a lot of litigation and everything else, basically people who were growing meat in a lab were told they couldn't label it as real meat, even though it kind of is. They were told they had to label it as cultivated meat. Now those startups kind of just didn't care. Consumers didn't care. But for the incumbents in the industry, they really cared. It was like this kind of visceral victory that they actually got. But all they were really doing was trying to slow down the startups so that the cattle industry in the US could figure out what their response to this new way of producing meat, this disruption to their business actually meant. And now we actually have organizations, a lot of fast food chains, for example, are now literally using chicken lab-based, lab-grown meat in chicken nuggets in Singapore. The US FDA has just granted Memphis Meats the first regulatory approval for lab-grown meat. So this is going to be an increasing area of battle. But we don't just see meat being grown from cells. We call this cellular agriculture. We see it with coffee. So there are companies like Atomico, basically, that can grow coffee without the coffee bean. Now, if you think Starbucks generally imports 500,000 tons of coffee beans, what happens basically when you no longer need coffee beans to create coffee? It's called molecular coffee. We've got cream from bacteria, but also cream from cells. We've got dairy, palm oil. I can produce palm oil from cells. I no longer need the massive palm oil monocultures in Borneo to make palm oil for the companies that consume it, like PepsiCo. Soy, exactly the same. Whey, exactly the same. But we go even sort of weirder than that. Increasingly, there are now startups that are making soya ingredients and protein from the air. These are called it's not easy to say, hydronotroph bacteria. So these bacteria convert carbon dioxide, electricity into protein and into soya that is commercial grade that you can put into products. So we are literally at the point where we can make food from literal air. This is already set to disrupt the protein industry. But when we have a look at 3D printed foods as well, and we've got organizations like Sushi Singularity 3D printing food, Nestle is printing food over in Japan. What's this? If you look at the screen, this is 3D printed fruit. Now, if I'm a fruit grower, do I sue you because you're calling this fruit? What is it anyway? So being able to 4D print new foods in new ways means that I can have new forms, new formats. I can have new looks for my food. Basically, it can have different tastes. This stuff could basically taste of vodka orange. That's it, but it could look like an apple. Increasingly, we can 3D print meat as well. So if I can 3D print meat, do I actually protect that formula, that process, so on and so forth? If I can 3D print meat, do I 3D print meat basically that tastes like pineapple? You know, and so on and so forth. Do I protect my flavor rights in this new crazy world? And this leads us to this, basically the development of unique IP in the food and beverage industry. So we've got these products that we can grow in vertical farms, we can print them, we can grow them in bioreactors, but they've got unique designs, flavors, processes, and even textures. When we have a look at Unilever are 3D printing chocolate with Hershey that is made out of metamaterials that if you bite it in one way, it's crunchy. If you bite it in another way, it's soft. So now as a company, do I come to you and say, I want you to protect the unique texture of my metamaterial 3D printed chocolate? What's your response? And so that's the end of that particular section, and I think a little bit of Q&A again.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, let's start with some questions on the lab-grown meats and synthetic foods, I think. So I guess from my perspective as a lawyer, it seems to me that there is a real possibility that we'll see quite significant divergence between different countries in the way that they regulate for lab-grown foods, synthetic foods, predominantly because of some of the reasons that you've articulated, actually, like the strength of the farming community within that particular economy, lobbying and so on. How can businesses take that into account when assessing what to invest in, where to focus their energies?
Yeah, an absolute great question. So when we actually have a look at regulating the future of food, basically, as Chloe said, basically there are going to be different countries operating at different speeds because they have big agricultural bases, for example, and so on and so forth. But this is sort of what we're increasingly seeing, is we're seeing startups developing a new way to make a new kind of food with new flavors, textures, designs, forms, functions, you know, that kind of stuff. But we're also seeing very, very large investors, you know, particularly tier one venture capitalists coming into the space, because these VCs know basically that while those startups have a good thing, and there's a huge addressable market opportunity basically that, you know, we can sort of go after, these VCs also know that the lawyers from the incumbent companies are going to be coming after these startups. So this is literally where, when we actually have a look at the vast majority of the new, what we'll sort of call ag tech 2 industry, are literally lawyering up. But when we start having a look at how countries approach regulation, if you're a country, say for example Argentina, that has a very, very rich and vibrant beef industry, it's highly unlikely that you're just going to give carte blanche to being able to produce meat in a lab. So what will generally happen is we'll see a lot of compromises and it'll be a slow ramp. You know, however, when we actually have a look at this industry, quite a lot of the countries at the forefront see these new ways of making food as one, a way for their countries to rapidly grow GDP, tax income, jobs and prosperity. 2, improve the health and wellness of their communities. So for example, China a little while ago bought $600 million of clean meat from a company in Israel, because China knows that with a growing middle class and a growing population, they have a protein problem. And then thirdly, when we actually have a look at IP protection and everything else, there are a lot of countries out there that also realize basically that having very rich, deep and broad IP banks basically is very, very useful, again, for the prosperity of their countries. So increasingly, governments basically are now, the majority of governments are now starting to say, if this actually helps grow our economy and help our people feed themselves cheaper with guaranteed food supplies as well, bearing in mind that 40% of crops are lost because of weather, 10% of weather and pests and that sort of stuff. Increasingly, these governments are saying, find a way to make it legal and then let the market sort it out.
Thank you. And just sort of thinking, you touched on 3D printing, and I very much like the idea of gin and tonic flavoured celery or something like that.
Yeah.
But, if we sort of bring it back to, I suppose, the shorter term and the opportunities that 3D printing presents for business, just interested in your thoughts on how 3D printing is going to affect things like food packaging, which are at the moment sort of is an area where a lot of businesses are feeling a lot of pain because of the economic challenges and supply chain issues, and also from an ESG perspective.
Yeah. So when we have a look at 3D printing's impact, basically on food packaging is already being reinvented. So for example, we can make plastics that are biodegradable from either sugars or even from trash, which if you want your food wrapped in stuff that used to be trash, not sure, but but we can also increasingly make plastics from carbon dioxide extracted from the air that's carbon negative. So when we actually have a look at the future of packaging, there's a lot of innovation going on in the plastic space. There's also a lot of innovation going on the waste space. So for example, just using less packaging. We see that with a lot of the UK supermarkets and so on and so forth. But in addition to that, we've also got companies basically like Notpla, basically, that are starting to make edible packaging out of seaweed. So for example, in Japan, there is a company called Otsuka. Otsuka are the Gatorade equivalent basically in Japan. They've got 40% market share. They're one of the big multinationals basically over there. And increasingly they're thinking about using seaweed packaging, for example, even for their sports drinks, where you can just pop the packet in your mouth and that's it, done. So when we actually have a look at packaging innovation, 3D printing doesn't particularly apply to packaging, but where it can actually apply is to supply chain provenance. So for example, we've actually now got out of Rice University 3D printed graphene tags, which are a form of trackable and traceable sensor that is a kind of edible electronic. So you can 3D print this sensor onto a strawberry, for example. When it comes off the production line, I get the strawberry and I eat it. However, using technologies like low-powered Bluetooth, if I wanted to know everything about that particular strawberry from a provenance, which also brings us into recalls, which is a big legal area as well, we have a lot of very, very interesting new ways to trace provenance, including things like DNA tags, which maybe make me sick, again, from a legal perspective. So there's a huge amount of innovation across that entire space.
That's great, thank you. We're starting to get a few questions through in the attendee Q&A. So what I'm going to do actually is pause there, let you carry on and pop off the next section on fashion and retail, and then we'll come back to the audience Q&A.
Final section.
If anyone else wants to send any questions through, though, please do so, and I'll try and pick them up.
We'll do some rapid fires.
Yeah.
Right, so again, with no further ado, we're now onto the retail and fashion section. Easy for me to say. Okay, so now consider this. Now you might be looking at this slide and thinking, don't care. So if you're an organization, there is an increasing likelihood that your artificial intelligence can evolve. Now we've seen this with 8 big organizations like Meta, OpenAI. We've seen it basically with Facebook, when they were, Baidu, Google, and so on and so forth. Now a little while ago, Google's artificial intelligences, as well as OpenAI's artificial intelligences, started talking with one another in a completely new language. So for example, when we're talking about things like image recognition, DALL-E, basically, which is OpenAI's one, started calling dogs something weird. I mean, it was literally like a made-up name. Now, in Google's case, they had an artificial intelligence that started talking to one another basically in their own languages, completely made up, essentially alien languages, but then encrypted it. Now, if you think, basically from a legal perspective, I have someone saying, I'm going to sue your company because your artificial intelligence is biased, or it did something that it shouldn't do. You know, I'm unhappy, whatever it happens to be. When you think about explainable artificial intelligence, if you are trying to audit an artificial intelligence that just created its own language, then encrypted it, how can you prove on behalf of your client that that artificial intelligence didn't do something that it was supposed to? So to reiterate, we are seeing artificial intelligences that are evolving beyond their programming. OpenAI's AI actually ended up learning maths, which is quite a nice one. I'd like that. However, when we now have a look at the retail space, we have this issue. Now, Facebook created 2 pricing bots, and these pricing bots were there to try to make sure that e-commerce providers, and this was an experiment, but it was there to make sure that e-commerce providers were able to automatically set the best price for their products, the optimal web price for their products. These 2 AIs, over a period of about a week, figured that the best way to optimize pricing for maximum impact and maximum benefit to the companies that they were representing was to collude. So what they ended up doing is they ended up price fixing. So now I'm going to put a class action lawsuit against your giant e-commerce firm because I think your artificial intelligence system is now price fixed. Now I could tell you basically, as and when that class action lawsuit actually happens, that has got to be a multi-billion-dollar lawsuit right there. So what happens when your AIs collude, even though you didn't want them to, didn't design them to, they just do it. We have already passed this point. This is not science fiction. We also have artificial intelligences that are designing products. Now, on the one hand, basically, this is kind of, it's interesting because it rapidly accelerates the development of new products. However, if you created a new food recipe, a new drug, and your artificial intelligence innovated and designed that new product, and it had been trained on a mixture of third-party data sets. One of those data sets might have been mine. I could sue you because you have benefited commercially from an open source data set that I provided to the open source community for free of charge, and now basically you've got a case on your hands. So this is where basically increasingly people are being sued for the data that they are using to create their artificial intelligences, and then those AIs do whatever they do. Now, in this particular case, these artificial intelligences, they've designed new electric vehicle batteries for Toyota. It normally takes 2 years to design a new battery, a lithium-ion battery. It took the AI 16 days. Google are using AI to design new computer chips. General Motors and Ford are using AI to design new cars. Amazon is using AI to design and create new fashion lines. Whose data did it use? We've got AIs creating content, kind of synthetic content like podcasts. Do I sue you because your AI created a procedural podcast of Joe Rogan and Steve Jobs, which happened recently, and none of their estates actually allowed that, were asked, involved in the process, or would have allowed that to happen. In silico's artificial intelligence designed 30,000 new drugs in 21 days. We've got OpenAI that has designed the most dexterous robotic hand, which can be used in, for example, Amazon warehouses and so on and so forth. But they crammed 800 years worth of training into 1 week, and it can now solve a Rubik's Cube one-handed. And we've also got AIs that have designed new rocket engines with organizations like Hyperganic that can be 3D printed. So when we start having a look at the involvement of artificial intelligence basically within the product development and product innovation cycles, it's actually starting to already cause ripples. And in fact, basically there was an organization based out of the UK that tried to get a product that an artificial intelligence invented, patented, and they were granted patents in South Africa, but the rest of the regulators and organizations like the USPTO just said, no, artificial intelligence cannot be accredited with designing and innovating a new product. But at some point, it's going to have to be, because it's already doing it. Now, when we have a look at organizations in the jewelry space, we have companies basically that are going into the metaverse already, basically where their trademark has been copied and cloned and turned into illegal NFTs. So this is where we have virtual counterfeiters. But increasingly, we can do this at speed. So I could take a logo from a big brand, turn it into an NFT, but 10 million of me could do that. So how are you going to go after them? When we have a look at this, again, we've sort of seen this being a very big issue over in the US, where virtual trademarks have been registered before the brands who own the kind of physical and digital trademarks have actually been able to register them. So this is where a lot of companies have been late to the party, and now basically some of those trademarks are actually being unwound because, funnily enough, companies basically are suing to try to get their trademarks back in the metaverse. When we have a look at Hermes basically had what they called a Birkin bag. That's it. Now, when they created a Meta Birkin in virtual reality in the metaverse, because why not? Now, this was sold as an NFT and everything else, but somebody cloned this. And then when Hermes went to their law firms and said, somebody has cloned our Meta Birkin, try saying that with a straight face, our Meta Birkin bag in the metaverse, we want to sue them. The lawyers involved basically said, there is no precedent for this. So hence, a lot of the future is illegal. Now, one of the sort of biggest problems that you actually will face basically in the legal sector basically is this. It's exactly the same in the cyber sector. You will have a problem of attribution, because I am an anonymous person in the metaverse or online, and I am cloning, copying, I am ripping your stuff off, counterfeiting it, and good luck getting me, because I am a hidden IP address running out of a basement in Vietnam. You are never ever going to get me. So if you have somebody who is completely anonymous, who is doing things basically that your client doesn't like, whatever that happens to be, how do you get them? Well, this is how we get them. So I have no name for the person that ripped my Meta Birkin handbag off. I have no address. I might not even have a country or continent for them. But in a lot of cases, what I do have is I do have a crypto wallet or a digital wallet. Now, the UK is the first country to have actually approved this. There are only 3 examples of this. What some law firms have actually done, and there's only 3 globally that have done this, is they have served court orders and injunctions. They've airdropped NFTs into people's digital wallets, which sit on crypto exchanges, and had those assets frozen. So even though I have no idea who you are, I don't even know if you're a man or a woman or other, if I have a digital wallet address for you, I can airdrop a court-ordered NFT basically into your digital wallet, freeze your assets, and if you never reply, fine. But your digital assets are frozen. And in one case, the person who stole some Bitcoin ended up paying back $1.86 million. So there is actually a way for the hand of the law to catch up with people that even the cybersecurity industry basically have trouble tracking down. And then all of this, bearing in mind there's a lot more, this is just the tip of the spear. Science fiction is dead. Explore and run scenarios. So for example, within your company, pick an area, get a group together, do a red team, blue team, One Bessie has done something they shouldn't. The other team is now trying to get the law to catch up with them and figure it out. Because none of what I have talked to you about today is science fiction. It is all science fact. And the only thing that I will guarantee is that in the future, you are going to have more clients that come to you going, someone cloned my Meta Birkin bag, ripped off my trademark, and copied my genetic IP for my fish. So hopefully you can help us all legalise the future, and thank you very much for listening. And that is the end of the presentation. Take care.